was when we started working. And certainly I started working. I grew up in Brooklyn, and cable had not yet come to most of New York City. And I scored an internship at CNN, which was just a year old and in the base of the World Trade Center. And that was my entree into, is my equivalent of your Hartford. I was just a young person eager to get into the business. I don't even think I would have called myself a news junkie then, because I don't know that anybody called ourselves news junkies then, but I knew I loved the news business. And like you said, telling stories and interacting with people. I was very shy, and that was a great way. I saw journalism as a great way to get into it. And of course, no one knew at the time in the early 80s, as CNN was launching, just how important that new network and how cable would transform not just the news industry, of course, but all of communications. So that's a tiny background. I've also worked at the New York Times and Public Radio's Marketplace. I have worked for many failed media startups, which actually has been quite instructive. And over the last 10 or 12 years, I've mostly been writing books because it's a safer haven than trying to be out in the field like you. So there you go.
All right, well, Lisa, so you segued really well into my first question for you, and it's about CNN. Did it seem like a brilliant idea at the time? I mean, now we look back on it, we say, wow, it's a no-brainer, right? But back then it wasn't, right?
Definitely not. In fact, it was when you were starting your career in Hartford, it was so hard for people to imagine that anybody, even journalists like us, would want to watch news all the time. And in fact, if you go back just a little bit further, or quite a bit further into the 50s and the 60s, it just was unimaginable that anybody really would want to watch news at all. It was really just sort of like an eat your vegetables proposition. I had to know the news, and the news would have to happen to be on when we were eating dinner. And that was that, broadcast news. Of course, there were newspapers, which were up until, I think, technically the late 70s or early 80s, newspapers were still a dominant form of news. Broadcasting eroded the dominance of newspapers, and CNN seemed like an absolutely lunatic idea by an absolutely lunatic person, Ted Turner, who at the time was really not somebody anybody could ever imagine associating with anything serious, except perhaps yachting. He was a skilled yachtsman, as you are a boat person too. That's so alien to me, but he was a internationally acclaimed yachtsman and a billboard salesman who basically by accident got into the business of news, mostly because he was fascinated by the concept of the marriage of cable and satellite, which was just starting back then, back in the mid 70s. It's incredible.
And so Ted had this concept, and because you wrote about this, he was so ridiculed at the time. They said CNN stood for the Chicken Noodle Network.
Yes. Nobody could imagine that there was an interest in news, but that Ted Turner could pull it off. And he knew that he wasn't a news guy. So, and at the time, just to set the stage for somebody who doesn't remember or who may not have been around then, there were really 3 news networks at that point. There were the local news stations. And of course, in New York, they were the best, as everything in New York is the best. But they just had limited programming. It just wasn't possible technologically and again, audience-wise to imagine that there would be a need for more. But it was also a nuts and bolts issue, because the film, when they were shooting film in the field, are you old enough to remember that, NJ, or did you post?
No,
you weren't around for that
era,
yeah.
but
yeah.
I mean, videotape came into it.
Videotape changed
different
everything.
Incarnations of videotape.
Right, exactly. Because it used to be, it wasn't always the videotape that people associate with their VCR at home.
And now, of course, it's not videotape at all.
Right. It's all digital. But the way, and you can do a live shot from this, as opposed to, or if you probably can't do a live shot from this, but.
Oh, no, I can.
You can.
No,
You would go on the
I've
air?
got a program on my iPhone that allows me with the to go live at the scene. It's called the Dejero app, and allows
Wow.
me to go live from anywhere at any time as long as I have a cell phone connection. In fact, I utilized it 3 or 4 years ago. There was it's a crazy story, but there was a derailment in the Flatbush Avenue station of the Long Island Railroad, and I was coming in from Long Island at the time, and I didn't know anything about it. The train that derailed was a train right in front of mine, and so we pulled into the station. I come in, and all of a sudden there's like smoke all over the place. Firemen are running, and it's like, what happened? They're like, it's a derailment. So I went around to where the derailment was, dialed up the app on the phone, and was doing live shots from the platform on the television station. All they have to do once I'm on this thing is flip a couple switches in the control room, and I'm live to 1 million people. It's crazy.
And that's what
I couldn't have imagined that.
Right. And that's why I want to take everybody back to 1979 when Ted announced the idea of CNN. And that what you just described was so sci-fi. But
Totally.
but what Ted had access to, because he had the money, was satellite dishes and smart people who worked previously in New York who'd been dying to figure out a way to accelerate the speed of news. They'd worked, most of them had worked, well, some of them had worked in the newsreel business. If anybody remembers or knows about newsreels, that was a more primitive form, but at the time, an incredible form of communications with the news, with visual news. And they were just hankering for what you just described. And the first, or a precursor to all of that, was the satellite dish. And that Ted was bold enough, and it wasn't, today news is unfortunately indelibly intertwined with politics. But at the time, Ted was a very conservative, he still is, a conservative person. He married Jane Fonda, but he wasn't married to her back then. And he really couldn't care less about news. He was more excited about the satellite and the idea of how the satellite was going to link the nation together. He had a station that's unlike PIX or NEW. Actually, a number of executives came from, this chief executive, Ted Kavanaugh, came from NEW, and chief producer. And they came from independent stations that were differently wired than network affiliates like the one that you work for. So they were all used to scrappy and not having big budgets, having to fight to get themselves ahead. And so this is the team. And also there were a lot of people who were like me, extremely young, extremely underpaid. I think it was $3.30 an hour that people were making, less than minimum wage. And they were flocking to Atlanta, where Ted had this independent television station, to this converted old country club that had been left for dead, that Ted bought for a song, retrofit, built a giant satellite farm in the backyard. And that was the underpinning of this communications revolution that transformed, as I say, the news business and the entire world. And what Ted's whole raison d'etre was that he wanted to show that this satellite could beam a signal out much farther than television signals typically could before. And for him, that was just a proof of concept. If he'd been able to pull off doing movies, HBO had already been in the works, and it beat him to the satellite cable marriage. But other than that, he was a true pioneer, and it was really just in the service of showing off this new technology.
And in that sense, right, he was a visionary, because so many people look down on that concept. Well, it'll never work. This guy who's just sort of tilting at windmills, right? And I remember, because this coincided. I mean, I graduated college in 1984.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember there were friends of mine who, were going to work for CNN, and a couple of us were like, "Are you kidding? Like, why would you go to work in a place like that, where clearly that's not going anywhere? You need to be pushing your resumes, to the three major networks." And there were a lot of people who really believed in it.
Yes.
And one of them was a friend of mine, Mary Alice Williams,
Uh-huh. Mhm.
who left WNBC to go work for Ted over at CNN, and ended up having a fantastic career there.
And was the first female bureau chief of a television network. She was not just the on-air presence, but she was also, because and they basically were very open about this. This is the case at NPR too. She was cheaper than hiring a man, so they hired her, and she did two jobs. Yes, yes. So you knew Mary Alice. She was an amazing presence.
And still do. She's been a real force in journalism now for well, I mean, 32 years for me. Add 10 years for Mary Alice.
Yeah.
No, she's had tremendous impact on the business. I guess what I'm wondering is, like, of all the topics that you could write on, you wrote about CNN, and there's a reason for that. And you wrote about CNN last year, right? I mean, that's when your book came out. Obviously, you spent a lot of time, a while working on it, but it came out last year. Why CNN and why now?
Well, so the book was timed to come out last year because CNN turned 40 last year. CNN started in 1980, just like this NPR book is timed to come out with the 50th anniversary of NPR. But I became fascinated by the history of the media, because while you've been on the ground in the field working in it, I've been for the last 10 years thinking a lot about how we got to this point. It seemed to me, years went by and it never had occurred to me, even though we saw the introduction of the internet and I covered the web evolution for the New York Times. I had never sort of stepped back and thought, aha, this is why CNN was such a game changer. And this new book, I learned about how NPR was such a game changer too, and how it united the nation. But before all of that, and to our topic about how we became a nation of news junkies, before that, news was really, except for the network news at night, really atomized. And we were all atomized. You might have a friend in Kansas, but you weren't up on something happening in Kansas unless it was extraordinarily huge, and that was rare. But now we're all together and we're all connected in that global village that Marshall McLuhan talked about, for better or for worse. And it really all started because of that technology that Ted Turner and the 300 people he enlisted to start CNN deployed. So I think my book before the CNN book was about Ray Kroc and Joan Kroc, the great philanthropist. And that, because I was writing about her, I had to think about how McDonald's came into being. Even though I'm not a McDonald's consumer, I was fascinated by how we became a nation that eats food on the run, and eats fast food. And looking at the roots of McDonald's taught me that. And so I think for the next project, I had a friend from CNN who called me up after he read that book about Ray and Joan Kroc. And he said, you really should write about the roots of CNN, because nobody's examined just how unlikely at every step of the way of CNN, there was a disaster. The satellite went missing. Ted Turner went missing at sea in a deadly yacht race. For a while, they thought he might be dead. He couldn't sell the television station that he owned. It was an NBC affiliate in Charlotte that he needed to sell to raise the money to pay for CNN. So in the year or so before CNN started, and it was only gestating for a year, it almost didn't happen a number of times. And when it did happen, they were still literally hanging from the rafters, running cable and trying to figure it out. It's not like they started. There were only 1.2 million people were able to receive CNN when it started in 1980. So that's how under the radar it was. So when I started to investigate and see all these stories and know that the people who were there were beginning to age, I thought this is really interesting, especially at this moment in time, NJ, when we're all, angry about the media, focused on the media, aware that we need the media to basically save our lives. In the last year, we've needed it, not just for presidential politics to understand that or deconstruct it, but also because of the pandemic, obviously. So I think, I probably would have sold the book more grandly if it had been about the polarization part of cable news, but I wanted to understand the roots of cable news. So that's a long answer to your question.
Well, so understanding the roots of cable news, and in case in point, CNN, right? Does that help you understand the trajectory of cable news? Because let's face it, cable news has undergone a few incarnations. And, how would you define the original orientation of CNN compared to where it is now?
Excellent question. Yeah, in the beginning, they really were such a scrappy upstart that they were just so thrilled to have the technology that allowed them to go on the air 24/7 with some taped installments. And in fact, Reese Schoenfeld, the late Reese Schoenfeld, who was CNN's first president, his whole vision was that instead of news being served up on a platter to the viewer, as it had been from newsreels on, the idea with CNN was that you would tune in and watch a story unfolding. And that was so exciting to him. He'd been wanting to do that. He'd been wishing that there was a capacity to do that for years. Now, all of a sudden, there was this ability to broadcast all the time, so that if you could teach the viewer the way we all learned how to use the phone to text, if you could teach the viewer that when you wanted to find out about news, especially if something was happening, if you tuned in, it would unfold right before your very eyes, instead of waiting for Walter Cronkite or you to deliver it every night at a certain time. And so that idea morphed and changed as Reese was fired and things began to change at CNN, became more sophisticated. And in the 1980s, anybody who was around then remembers that there were a number of seminal news moments: the Shuttle Challenger, Tiananmen Square, the little girl in the well in Texas was really a pivotal moment for CNN, as non-hard news as that might seem to a real news junkie. That was a big story that drew a lot of people to CNN. They wanted to watch it. They didn't want to wait for the networks to tell them what was going on, although they did join too. So the whole idea that news morphed and changed before our very eyes as CNN got more sophisticated, as news warranted, and then boom, 1996 comes along, and that's when both MSNBC and Fox News started. And that's when the dialogue really changes, because that's when it became supremely commercialized. And it's just like the story with McDonald's. The minute there was competition, everything changed. But in that 16-year run,
but also, Lisa, that the minute there was big money to be made, right? I mean, because that's what's happening now with Fox.
yes.
Because now they're seeing that they don't have to have everybody in the country watching them. If they have a loyal core audience of 35% of the cable viewers,
right,
will only watch them and only trust what they say, then that's big bucks. That's a lot of money.
right.
And that's what's going on now is they're chasing the audience for profit. It's not about, enlightening people.
Right.
I mean, maybe on some level attempting to change people's political views or political orientation. That may be the subtext. And a lot of people look at this and say, obviously they're out to, to change people. They have an agenda. Well, they have a political agenda, yes, but it's really about money.
Well, and I'm glad you raised that point, because when Ted Turner started CNN, as I said before, he was a conservative, but the idea of when you hired real news people, of there being an agenda in the 80s was just anathema. You would never talk about that kind of stuff.
Because that's old school. That's the old school broadcast journalism is to, I tell people, and I'm, whatever. I mean, I'm a certain generation, right? I mean, I grew up with Peter Jennings, Bill Butel, Cronkite, Dan Rather, those people.
Great.
So, and my feeling is, right, okay. And so when people ask me, oh, well, you have an agenda too, don't you? I say, you know what? I come to work every day. and there's a dartboard on the wall, and I have a dart in my hand. And the bullseye is objectivity and fairness.
Right.
I come to work and I take that dart and I throw the dart at the dartboard. And the dartboard is the bullseye's objectivity. I'm aiming for that bullseye.
Yes.
Okay. Do I hit that bullseye every day? No, I don't. Am I trying to? Yes. And that's the difference.
Yes. Yes. And money, of course, is necessary to the world. And it certainly was necessary at CNN's beginning when Ted finally sold the television station that gave him the $25 million that he needed to get CNN off the ground in 1980.
$25 million.
$25 million.
Chump change.
Right, exactly. Although now you could start a whole TV station, as I keep saying right here,
Yes,
right?
yes,
But and have an international audience. But when Turner started that in 1980, and he literally had no idea how he was going to keep going. He had that whole "if you build it, you will come" philosophy, and that's why he's such a fascinating person. And I hope everyone will read the book, because as crazy as Ted Turner was, he was a visionary and he was fearless, which, we were talking about this before, you and I. Fearlessness is really what is necessary for almost anything to succeed. And he just didn't worry about how the bills were going to get paid. They had very few advertisers because they had very few audience members, because cable wasn't everywhere. But he believed, if he did it, that it would work. And the truth is, it didn't work financially for quite some time. And he was he put himself in a very precarious position by trying to buy CBS. Remember that in 85, he tried to buy CBS and MGM. He did buy MGM, then he had to sell it back because of the finances just didn't work. He was rich, but he wasn't mega rich. And so in its earliest years, CNN really was a nicely funded experiment in television news that gave a lot of people careers, gave some people change in careers, got them out of places they didn't necessarily want to be. It fed a lot of people to local markets all around the country. It was a proving ground. And in that time, the whole time, it was indoctrinating the general public into imagining that they should be able to get news whenever they want. Of course, that all got amped up a whole different way once the internet began. But that's what CNN really sowed the seeds of news junkiehood, the way the iPhone, is the best attention deficit disorder invention of all time. So it's just good food for thought, I think, to look back, to reflect back, and especially to look at Ted Turner's he never had any day-to-day operational input to CNN, except he did get one of his girlfriends a job early on. But mostly he stayed out of the day-to-day. There were no politics. If there were politics, they were covering politics. And that's just all bets were off once the networks themselves had to morph and change with competition.
All right, well, Lisa, you're very prolific. And forgive me for saying this, but CNN is last year's book. Let's talk about NPR. Why NPR? You said obviously before that we're coming up on a big anniversary for NPR. But NPR and writing about NPR and writing about the founding mothers of NPR really resonates in this time and place, doesn't it?
Well, NPR, like CNN, nobody was sure it was going to work. When it started, FM radio, which is where National Public Radio was transmitted to member stations all around the country, and there weren't that many. There were only 90 in 1971. FM was also ran as cable, or UHF, where Ted had got his feet wet in television. FM was hard to tune in. Not every radio came equipped with FM, and not every car had FM in it. And of course, the cars where radio, even then, especially then, reigned supreme. So NPR started in 1971 with very little money. It was an afterthought in the Public Broadcasting Act. It was literally taped in at the last minute. because television was the mandate from President Johnson and the people who were the men who were writing that law. And it was only some crazed educational radio people who worked at small, low wattage radio stations that were affiliated with universities who came up and said, no, you have to include public radio. So when NPR launched, nobody imagined, nobody knew what it was going to be. They literally, like CNN, it was kind of like, well, what are we going to put on this thing? And the first thing they put on was a hearing from the Senate, which was so unprecedented then because C-SPAN had just started and most people couldn't access C-SPAN, and who would want to watch, a Senate hearing. And then as the different people got their hands on it, various people shaped it the way they wanted it to sound. And the most important person turned out to be a woman, and women were not allowed to be broadcasters then unless they were covering women's issues. But because they were paying so poorly and because she was the best person in the room, Susan Stamberg wound up getting the job as the host of the show. And she was completely abjectly disinterested in DC politics or wonky government stories. She was just a humanist, the supreme humanist. And at first they didn't want her on the air because she sounded like she was from New York, which she was. Stations in the middle of the country were concerned that she sounded too New York, which is also code for she sounded Jewish. But the people at NPR kept her on. She was so good. And sure enough, the listeners that NPR did have in the beginning fell in love with her warmth and her humanity. She was so different than the guys, no offense, who were on the network news, which is the alternative, the broadcasting, the supreme broadcasting in the 70s. And she brought news to a whole new level, especially in smaller markets where they don't have well-funded television stations, or certainly not radio stations, only networks, or that was it. And so it's so interesting to have written this book about CNN and then step back and look at a different sort of news addiction that was engendered by that, because up until then, the radio really was, there were a couple of all news stations by the mid to late 70s in a big city like New York. But for most people, radio was something you put on in the car and sang songs with the kids while you were driving them somewhere. It wasn't, you might hear a news break at the top of the hour, but the idea that you would have this really rich conversation, these sonically, sophisticated portraits of places that people couldn't go, which of course are much easier to do with radio than they are with television, or at least they used to be. It was a real revolution. And I had no idea, even though I'd worked in public radio, I had absolutely no idea what its roots were or how modest they were and how precarious they were at the very beginning. So
Lisa, can you explain to folks why we need NPR? Why do we need public radio?
Well, do we need anything? I don't know. Yeah, I guess we do. I guess we need we need information, right? But public radio it's a major force on par with the commercial networks. I mean, it is a major commercial force unto itself. But what it's done, as it has morphed and changed over the years, just like CNN has, it sparked a revolution. Many people have jobs who wouldn't have had jobs, who don't necessarily want to or need to work on the network level in local markets all around the country, which have really sparked a rich revolution in radio as something more than just entertainment. But really, NJ, why do we need any media? We need media to keep in check the power that the government to transmit important information about deadly pandemics and fires and other terrible things that happen around us. I think more than ever, the media, the role of the media is more important than ever in informing and in balancing our society. Unfortunately, it's just tilted so far into what you were
Oh,
saying before, into a
yes,
different universe.
it's different tribes basically, and
Yeah.
we'll acknowledge that. I think that's sort of how it's evolved.
Yes.
I made the point before that I think that the entities that are going in those directions are chasing the money. You know,
Right.
they've decided that a particular agenda is profitable, and they can move in that direction, and that's what that's about.
Hmm.
Um, but with respect to public radio, I've said this to people because it comes up at cocktail parties, at dinner parties, or whatever. Why? How do I find out what's really going on? you know, and people ask that now, and that is sort of, in my opinion, like the last question anybody should be asking nowadays, because the technology has never been more advanced to
Right.
disseminate information than it is right now. Yet
Right.
people believe the craziest things.
Well,
It makes me, it really makes me angry, because there's
yes.
never been a greater need for straight ahead mainstream media than there is right now. Then you
Yes.
talk to people and they rail about the media.
Right.
There's a difference between the news and the media, right?
Right. Well, and that's why a couple weeks ago, I was so fortunate to be asked to speak to a group of high school educators who were all eager to figure out, how do we teach kids to parse through the media
Right.
and figure
And how
out,
to know.
ask questions about who's telling me these stories. How do I encourage media literacy? But you're so right. We have more information than ever before. And yet we're drowning.
Better technology to
Yes.
disseminate that information on a massive scale.
Yes.
And still, there are people that believe the craziest things.
Yes. Yes. Now, to be fair, I've been mildly obsessed during the pandemic, while I was writing this NPR book, with reading all of the pandemic books that were written about the last pandemic 100 years ago.
Hmm.
And to be fair, obviously things were quite different then in every single way, except that humanity is flawed and people are flawed, and they believed all kinds of crazy things back then. It was very difficult to transmit uh, credible, reliable information back then, even though there were newspapers. There were, of course, what we have now is we have multiplicity of news sources, but back then we had multiplicity of newspapers, and in an average, even a smaller town, there would be a number of publications, and one would be known as one political persuasion and one would be known as another.
You got to
And
read 5 newspapers to know what's going on.
exactly, if you wanted to know
Well,
roundly
right,
what's
right,
going on,
right.
right?
And that's sort of where we are right now,
Yes.
because, I think, you know, it pains me to say this, but I think that there's a certain percentage of people out there now
Hmm.
who are either they're too busy, they're too distracted, uh, they're too lazy.
Hmm.
They don't necessarily want to know the facts of what's going on. So whether they're lazy, whether they're working two jobs, whether they're distracted, whatever the reason, these are the people who would open up the newspaper and go straight to the editorial page, find the op-ed writer that they like and read that person, and they form their opinion on that. They don't want to snap open, the A section of the Times and then go through it and get, or the Wall Street Journal, whatever it is, get the sort of objective rendering of the facts, draw their own conclusions, and then they base their opinions on that. There are a lot of people that just, for whatever the reason is, want to be told what to think. And that's really disturbing to me.
It's interesting. Do you remember when we both started working? We both started working in the early 80s, in the mid 80s. There was this whole maxim: is news what people need to know or what they want to know? And the
Right.
whole conversation was, how much in a nightly newscast how much international news should there be? Because people don't really care. Well, now, of course, you could just program your devices to only feed you national news from one nation. You don't have to wade through all the
Well,
other stuff, right? Because it's all, or if you only wanted to read or listen to sports and one sport, you could just wall out everything else.
Right.
So I think that that's a really interesting question to ask now. And also to your point, how much does the average person need to know? I would say many times during the pandemic, as I was reading this avalanche of data, I'm not an epidemiologist. I didn't go to med school. I can't parse through these numbers. I'm not qualified to parse through these numbers and
Isn't that
figure
why
out.
we have a CDC? Isn't that
Right.
why we have a National Institute
Exactly.
of Health to tell us this? Isn't this why Anthony Fauci, isn't this his raison d'etre, right? I mean, okay, so Fauci says this, all right, maybe he's making an educated guess about this stuff, but he knows better than I do. So I'm going to trust him.
But that's the
Until some
danger.
QAnon person tells me, whatever,
Right.
I sort of feel like we've lost our minds. It's crazy.
We have, but I would posit that we've partially lost our minds because there's so much coming at us from every single direction.
Right.
And and any sane person who's just trying to keep it together, certainly in the last year, their family, their life, their own health, they're just, even if you're just a solo person living in a small room, it's hard enough to function day to day before the pandemic. But then when you add the pandemic and the politics to it, and if you really are having all these inputs, I feel like it's crazy making. So that's the other reason why I've enjoyed dipping back into history, because these questions, one of the reasons that President Johnson wrote the Public Broadcasting Act in the late 60s was because there was a huge concern about commercial television and how it was, the main programming at night, not the news, but the main programming was taking over people's the mind share of the people and making people couch potatoes. That was the big phrase, we're a nation of couch potatoes. So there was a huge concern among intellectual people that was an issue, and that they needed to start something that was more broccoli than just razzle dazzle. And that was also one of the reasons that Ted Turner, when he got into television, again, it was all an accident, and I hope you'll read the book because it's really fascinating how and why he accidentally got into television. But he was railing against the networks and the programming that was available back then. So it's a slightly different conversation, but the conversation existed back then, and certainly if you go even further back, it was an issue then too. So we've always had people who are vulnerable and gullible and lazy, and it's just now it seems like it's easier to be both more informed and to be lazy and vulnerable. And if I had the answer, I wouldn't be writing these history books. But the reason I love writing the history books is reading old media and hearing what people have to say. NPR at the beginning wasn't a hard news outlet. It was really more of a magazine show. And there was a issue internally. Do we become more like the networks and deliver hard news about the DC insider stuff? Nobody called it that then in the 70s. Or do we have long, thoughtful, ponderous interviews with creative people about their process and take people to the scenes of interesting places that they couldn't see? And what won out? Yes, there are interesting features, but what won out was this zeal for hard news. And certainly Susan, Linda Wertheimer, Nina Totenberg, and Cokie Roberts, the three latter ladies, personified hard news in the 80s and 90s as they were coming into their fame. So it's a tough, there's no answer. That's the tough part.
All right, well, you're gonna have to work on some answers now, because we're gonna turn this over to the audience and see who's got a question.
Great. I don't see any in our chat, but maybe I'm not looking in the right place.
Oh, somebody did ask me, Chris asked me if I would repeat again what the app is on my phone, the proprietary app that allows me to, with a few switches in the control room, to go live to 1 million people. It's called Degero, and it's spelled D as in David, E-J-E-R-O, DeGero.
It's a person's name?
Oh, well, no, it's a company.
Oh, it's a company.
The DeGero app for the
Got it.
phone, and the station has a subscription to it. It's a subscriber service, and then that allows us to go live from the scene. It's crazy. I mean, getting into this business years ago, I could not have envisioned that. But when I started at Channel 7, we had 3 shows. We had a 5 o'clock show, 6 o'clock show, and an 11 o'clock show.
And that was actually, to have 2 late afternoon shows was a lot in those.
That's right. A 5 o'clock show was like an innovation. Like, wow, I don't know. We'll just try this 5 o'clock thing. We'll see if that works. Because for years, like when I was growing up, Channel 7 had in the late afternoon had what was called the 4:30 movie.
Right.
Like,
I
the
remember.
Ten Commandments and Breakfast at Tiffany's and all this stuff, right? And that in 4:30, and then the news would come on with Bill Buttel and Roger Grimsby would come on at 6 o'clock, and then we'd be on for for half an hour, and then the network would come on. But yeah, I mean it's amazing how it's changed. Now we have a newscast that goes on at 4:30 in the morning, and they're not done till they hit GMA at 7 a.m. Then GMA is on, and then they come on again at 12 noon. They do 12 noon for an hour. Then they come on at 4 o'clock and then do 4, 5, 6. Then they hit David Muir at 6:30, and then they got 11 o'clock newscast. I mean, it's just, I think it's great. And I know I'm going to sound proprietary here and a bit selfish, but I mean, I really do believe in Channel 7 and Channel 7 product, the ABC News product. I mean, I've worked for them for years. I could have gone elsewhere, could have done some other things, but I stayed with them because I value the integrity of the editorial product.
Well, and that's another difference. We were talking about this before everyone came in. There were people who came to a network or a newspaper and they stayed.
Yeah.
That was how it worked. And
Oh,
now
I guarantee
people
you,
hop
Bill
around.
Buttel would still be on Channel 7 now.
Yep.
If he hadn't retired when he did, I mean, he, Bill had to retire. But no, if he could have done it, he'd still be on TV now. And we're very fortunate, obviously, that we had Bill Ritter, who wanted to do the job and does a fantastic job for us. So, we're lucky that Bill was there at the right time and has carried the mantle and, all these years, and it's been great. So
We have some questions. I'm going to get up. I see that it's dark here, so I'm going to turn on the light behind me. Actually, I'm going to turn on this light. Whoa.
Okay. So, all right. So we have a question.
Yes.
Okay. This is really good. Can NPR survive as a broadcast network in the days of on-demand podcast?
See, it's a great question. It's interesting. I think, I can't remember the exact numbers, but if you look at the top podcasts, most of them or many of them are produced by NPR. So we had this question when I was working at the New York Times in the late 90s on this pioneering, now defunct section called Cyber Times, which was basically the teaser way of putting the New York Times online. And then we did extra added, I hate to use the word content, but we did work online exclusively. And that was in the days before, like the early days of cable, when only a couple million people were logged on to cable. And same thing with NPR. Everybody's experimenting, going crazy. WABC probably has a bunch of podcasts too. And everybody feels like they have to play with it.
You've got to be this right. And then figure out what it's going to be, but at least get on the scoreboard.
Exactly. And NPR, where their stock and trade is audio to begin with, it is morphing and changing. I mean, you can get it on Alexa, you can get it in various forms or fashions, but it all goes back to that brand of NPR. So yeah, can it survive as a broadcast network? That is, again, if I could answer that question, I wouldn't be writing history books. I would be leading NPR, hopefully. But I don't know. I just know that is the eternal question. We saw that question too when I was covering the rise of the web. Everybody said, well, how will the record companies survive? How will publishers survive. We've asked it about every single old school legacy, I think they call it, medium. And the answer is it survives in a new and changed form. They've been predicting the death since I started working in the 80s. I really wanted to work at a newspaper. And in the 80s, they said, oh, don't try to work at a newspaper because they're dying. And I just lucked into this job at CNN, which got me an internship at CNN, which got me on the broadcast track. But literally for decades, they've been saying newspapers will die. Now, of course, we could have the conversation about how newspapers on a local level are in serious trouble with this buy-up by venture capitalists who are eradicating the kinds of great local news reporting that you do, that's necessary for a newspaper to be part of a robust community. But nonetheless, I think it will exist. It's just it's changing, and they're scrambling to figure out how to change it. So.
All right.
There's another great question there too.
Yeah, I got another question. Right. Where will news reporting be in 5 years?
I want to hear
I'm glad they're not asking me that question.
No,
I want another 5 years. Okay.
Yeah, you just need 5 years, and then you can sail off somewhere. And
I don't know.
Well, Nina Totenberg says her father lived to 102 and kept working literally on his deathbed he was a violinist and a violin teacher. So she says she's going to work that long, and she's 76. So you're probably in the same camp. You'll keep going as long as they'll let you, right? But the tools of the trade have changed. I mean, I would assume that your work is less packaged news reports and much more live reports than it was at the start of your career, even 10 years ago. Is that?
Yeah. I'm going live every day from the scene of something.
Right.
That's one of the things that I find so rewarding about my job. And that is that I get to go to these different places, and you develop this really rich sense of the neighborhoods of the city, the cultures of the city, the people of the city, and that whole fabric of New York, and also the metropolitan area for that matter. Because I cover stories all over. I'm not limited by geography. I can go anywhere.
Right.
And certainly overseas. I've done a lot of overseas reporting. But for me, that's been the most enjoyable part of it, is getting to these places. But yes, you're right. It's a lot more live on the scene reporting. It's a lot more of synthesizing what's happening, not having a lot of time to do that, and having it come flowing out of your mouth as if you spent 3 hours writing it. That's, so that's sort of the high wire act of live television.
Yes.
But it's also kind of what keeps your blood flowing. So I kind of like that.
And most people in the news business were news junkies before everybody else was. You have to be, right? Because if you weren't, it would be really hard to do that, to execute that.
No question. So Lisa, another question here.
Okay.
Between Steve Jobs and Ted Turner, the George Floyd trial would have been in camera, or wait, let me see. I'm not sure. I'm trying to make sure I understand the question. Do you see the question? Can you read it, Lisa?
I don't see it. I see question number 4, constructing the ideal media universe.
No, this one is between Steve Jobs and Ted Turner, the George Floyd trial would have been on camera. Or did the two of them, Jobs and Turner, ever work together or correspond?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I do with the trial right now. I've been thinking about the discussion. I don't know exactly when it was. Perhaps you remember, NJ, the whole idea of cameras in the courtroom was a huge discussion for many years, and there were many judges who would not allow it.
Then you had O.J. Simpson, which I think just set the tone, that broke all of the rules, and that paved the way for all of this stuff.
NPR's third president, as far back as the late 70s, was going to the Supreme Court and asking the Chief Justice if they could use audio, or he ideally he was focused on radio, of course. He wanted to transmit the Supreme Court deliberations. Right. So people have long wanted to do that, and of course it has. I'm sure, just as you could say that C-SPAN and cameras and just the visuals, it took the House and the Senate to allow a long time to decide to allow cameras in the chambers, because they were so concerned about how it would change everything. And of course, it could. I'm sure people have written theses about that, you know, how the people behaved. They had to show up more. And it's the same thing with courtroom, of course, this real life courtroom drama. As far as Steve Jobs and Ted Turner, I never saw that they met one another.
Oh, they probably, you know, had cocktails out in Aspen, right?
Right,
No, I mean,
exactly.
all
Right.
those guys do that.
Exactly. They were at the confab in Aspen. Walter Isaacson wrote this magnificently spectacular biography of Steve Jobs. It's a doorstopper, and it was authorized by Steve Jobs. And I loved reading it because we have lived that revolution. But for anybody who hasn't lived that time, it's a really important book about the rise of that technology. But it is an interesting correlation because they both, of course, changed the world in their respective ways. So,
no question. No question. So I don't mean this to sound like a lightning round, but we have a few minutes and I want to get to as many questions as I can. So if you were to construct the ideal news media universe in the US, what would it look like?
Well, again, if I was in that position, I personally don't really consume a lot of broadcasting right now. If I lived in New York,
Really?
I follow you on social media, but I haven't been following a lot of broadcasting as a sort of sanity preservation, what's left of it, mechanism.
Hopefully you're the only one.
Right, exactly. If the whole economy depended on me, it would have shut down a long time in every single way. But that's a really excellent question, and I'm loath to answer it. I grew up in that 3-network universe with a bunch of newspapers. My father would come home with all the newspapers every night. And there's something quaint about that and retro about it that seems more sober in the sense of, you know, what you were talking about before. But I know that that's impossible, and I'm not advocating going back. And I honestly don't. I'm tap dancing because I don't know the answer. Do you have an answer to that? I mean, I know what you prefer.
Well, look, for me, all right, like for me, the ideal media universe would be where we have more than one news organization, because that's a multiplicity of sources is extremely important. Okay, so I totally buy that, right? But I wish that news organizations in general would take the approach of aiming, as I said in my metaphor, for the bullseye every day. You know, and I said, look, I'm being candid with you. I'm being honest, right? I'm saying I don't hit that bullseye every day. And why don't I, right? I mean, nobody's asked me that question yet, but it's a good question. Like, why don't I hit the bullseye every day? Because I have a certain education, because I have a certain upbringing, because I have a certain life experience, okay? That inevitably I'm going to get pulled in one direction or another, and I'm aiming for the bullseye. I can't hit it every day, but at least I'm trying. I think that most days, I mean, I'm trying to be objective about myself, right? But I think most days I get pretty close to the bullseye if I don't hit it. But that's what I'm trying to do. Some media people are not aiming for the bullseye.
Well, right.
Just in the bullseye.
There's a huge conversation.
The bullseye's over there, you know?
Right. Or the conversation is this whole idea that you need to advance a particular point of view in order to be successful or
in order to make money, right?
Yeah.
But I just wish, so that in terms of the ideal media universe would be a multiplicity of news sources that are all aiming more or less for the middle. That's what I'd like to see, because then I can come home at night, I can turn on the TV, and I can get a relatively objective rendering of the facts. And then I can, draw my own conclusions about what I feel is happening to the country, to the world, whatever. And, I just don't like the idea that when I turn on the TV, I see somebody giving, his opinion for the first 15 minutes. and then having a whole bunch of other people, either echoing the same opinion or arguing with each other. Tell me what happened. I've been working all day.
It's so interesting that when CNN started, I don't know if anybody watching remembers Crossfire, and that was really, I mean, there were some shows on PBS that had, certainly in the Sunday morning shows, had people yelling at one another. Actually, they weren't really yelling at that point. They were still kind of listening to each other.
But at least you have two different sides.
Yeah, exactly.
Two different sides. Now I turn on the TV and, the guy gives his opinion, or woman, whatever, gives their opinion. And then, for the next, 45 minutes, the people are like basically reinforcing the media person's opinion.
Right.
And you don't have a really intelligent give and take. And maybe that's because that's not profitable. Maybe because it's so, our politics are so tribal that people just want to see their opinions ratified by the people they trust. And that's what they're going to tune in for. And these media will give those people what they want. And it goes back to your question. And that is, do we tell the people what they want to know or what they need to know? And unfortunately, I think we're living in a world where, there's a fair amount in media now where they feel an amount of, an objective by some media organization where it's like, let's just give the people what they're going to tune in for.
Well, it used to be too that you had no choice, whether you wanted it or you needed it, that was the only way you could get it. And now you can say, I don't like that guy, or I don't like that outlet, so I'm going to go to the other one. So that choice, it goes back to that choice is both it's a blessing and a curse. It's a boon, but it's also, it complicates things. Okay, people, we want to go. Oh, there's the Wash Post. Oh, the journalism degree to apply for a job. Wow, recent college graduate with it. Yeah, these days, wherever you have to meet as many people as you possibly can, and just hope that one of them will hire you. And
what I tell graduates, because I'm in contact, people contact me all the time about this stuff. And I've been very fortunate that I haven't had to look for another job for 3 decades. So I'm a good person to ask, but not a good person sometimes.
Right.
What I do tell people is to get into the digital side of it, because that's what the future is going to be ultimately. And that's been one of the areas where they're doing a lot of hiring, and a lot of young people are getting hired, and a lot of really talented, thoughtful young people coming out of school are getting hired, and they're doing really, really well. And we're very fortunate to have them in the newsroom and working alongside us. So they make us better, they make us smarter, they make us more relevant.
That's good. Yeah, I would say the same thing, but networking is so important, and innovation is important too.
For sure. Okay, so another question. Should NPR's fundraising join forces with ProPublica? Seems it would bolster the mission of both organizations, eliminate the balkanization of the fundraising effort among news junkies.
It's interesting. So the NPR funding is really complex. It's both on the national level, and then the stations raise a significant amount of money of which they pay a portion to license the content of NPR. So when you give money to your local station, it's indirectly going to the network, which raises money by selling underwriting, AKA ads. They don't get much government money. That's a myth. The stations get the lion's share of what government money there is, and it isn't an enormous sum or a life-sustaining sum, but it is a conflict that they or confusing that they have the public airwaves and that they are getting any sort of government money. That's a whole other conversation. But to the person's question, NPR does seem to have teamed up with places like Kaiser News and other outlets on occasion. But as far as the fundraising part of it, anybody who's in fundraising here knows how complex it is when two organizations unite together and try to merge the monies. I could probably talk more about it at another time, because I do understand it more granularly, but it's probably, if that person wants to write to me, I'd be happy to engage with them.
All right. Well, there's a member of the audience that feels I'm missing the point. of ad-supported broadcasting cable news operations, that my bullseye, my metaphorical bullseye, is no longer valid. And that's why public media is critical. I would disagree with the premise, but I would agree with the conclusion.
Right. I would too. I would too. Yes. Yes.
And I think actually that is sort of the point that I'm making, is that I do think that the bullseye is valid for those of us who are aiming at the bullseye. The bullseye, right, in my opinion, has never been more valid, and to use the other word, vital, than it is right now. So if anything, I would advise the younger people want to get into journalism, coming in behind me and some of my contemporaries, that try to do the news in a straight ahead, mainstream fashion, because people need to be able to trust what you're saying. And you also need to admit if you make mistakes and say, okay, well, you know what, I probably went too far this way, or I went too far that way. And I can go back over my career and say, wow, you know what, that week, you probably went too far in this direction, but then you made up for it the next week. I remember, covering, because I've done a lot of trips to Israel. I've done over 13 round trips to Israel. It's the Intifada in 2000. Just being on the ground is learning about it in college and graduate school is no substitute for being on the ground.
For being there, for seeing, of course.
It. So you learn so much and you understand it so much. The more you're there, the more you're involved, immersed in it, the more you understand it. And so I think that my understanding of the Israeli-Palestinian issue has become much more nuanced, much more complex than it was at first. So, look, do people learn? Do people evolve? Yes, absolutely. But that's what it's about,
right?
And you have to be willing to acknowledge that, what? Yes, I have worked hard. I have been there. I have observed things. My positions on some things maybe have changed, and that's useful.
We could talk about that for hours, but I want to answer some of the other questions that are here right now, just because they're good ones. And So someone's asking about the Washington Post and Jeff Bezos. Has he stayed out of the news business sufficiently, meaning the daily Washington Post operations? Yes. I mean, he bought it. And as far as I know, he doesn't have anything to do. Like Ted Turner, he basically said, here's the money, keep going. So good for him. At what point did NPR start buying shows like This American Life? I don't know what year that started. I know that Ira Glass started his career at NPR and then left and started This American Life. I mean, they've been incubating interesting shows since almost the beginning. They did an extraordinary documentary in the very early years called Father Cares about the Jim Jones massacre. But they've been experimenting and changing all throughout, but things like that, I couldn't tell you the specific year. I'm sorry. Sorry, NJ, I'm just plowing.
No, it's good. I mean, again, I made a joke about the lightning round, but let's try to get through as many pieces as possible. But yeah, so Ted Turner seems to have stopped being a public figure for a while. Why do you think he isn't more publicly vocal? Well, how old is Ted Turner now?
Ted Turner's 82, 83. He is ill. That's why you haven't heard from him in a while. He's got Lewy body dementia, which is the same dementia that Robin Williams had. So he's been ill for quite some time. And once he basically got kicked out, he sold out his controlling interest and then all of it, and then basically exited the media stage mostly, basically, and went full tilt into environmental preservation. So he would speak and philanthropy, and he would speak, about at cable conventions and wherever, up until his illness got bad enough, but he has not actively been involved in the media for a long time. And as I say, it's very important for people to know, he never had day-to-day operational input at CNN, a la the Murdoch world and Fox. But we can talk about that the next time we have a conversation.
Well, maybe that's going to be your next book.
No, people have written some terrific books about that. I am in a new documentary that'll be coming out in a little while about the Murdoch empire and the Ted Turner thread and their feud, which is interesting, but no.
Okay, so what responsibility does TV broadcast have to navigate challenges to fact?
Well, I think NJ's been pretty clear about that. I think, the problem today is, what are facts? Your facts may be different than my facts. NJ and I come from a different universe of broadcasting and have different sorts of training and ethics than people today have. And that's not to say that everybody who doesn't agree with us is unethical, but they believe in a different sort of news business than he and I do. Not to speak for you, but everything you've said is something that if I was still a working journalist, I would say too. And certainly the principles are principles that I apply in writing biography, because I take that very seriously in the sense of objectivity, as much as there is, a myth of objectivity too. So.
But what about the idea, but Lisa, what about the idea that the questioner is getting at here? And that is, that why are we living in a world where we can't even agree on facts?
Well, I would say it's because of CNN, not because of what CNN propagates, but because of the dissolution and the overpopulation, the enormous number of sources that come at us. Right. It used to be that you trusted the people who were on the news to have had a certain amount of training in the mindset
you had
gatekeepers, shared.
Right? You had gatekeepers.
Right.
You had NBC, CBS, ABC, PBS. You had gatekeepers that said, and you know what? And I would go back to a time where you have some sort of unhinged congressperson who would say something that was ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
And then, separately, independently of one another, the editorial decision making at each of the networks would say, you know what, that guy's crazy. We're not putting him on TV. That's nuts. And the guy wouldn't get on. Nowadays, it seems that the person who says the craziest thing is the person that actually does get on TV.
Right. We want as crazy as possible.
Crazy,
yes.
Right?
But back to the responsibility, that's the challenge, because whoever's in charge, that's why there are editors and producers, and their job is to arbit and mediate and set the tones and the standards. And the tones and the standards are completely different than for those of us who grew up, in the 70s and 80s, seeing a different sort of media than exists today. So what we think is the responsibility is different than today. And again, not to dance around that issue, but, I see what's happening at places like the New York Times, where if an opinion is run on the editorial page, there was basically an insurrection in the newsroom about an opinion that people didn't agree with being, and that's a rabbit hole I think we shouldn't get down right now, because it's.
But the fact that it's happening complex. At the Times, is yes. a sign of the times.
Yes, yes, very much so. Very much. So.
We have a question that really shouldn't be addressed to us, because we can't really answer that, and that is, what did Chris Cuomo think of Andrew's situation? Chris Cuomo, by the way, I consider Chris Cuomo a friend. So I don't know what he thinks of it. However, I do admire the fact that he has not discussed this on his show, and
hasn't.
No, he hasn't. I mean, he's taken his position that, what, I'm going to stay out of this, and I'm not going to get on TV and talk about it, and I think that's appropriate.
Yeah, it's complicated. As is the other question about sexual harassment issues. Someone asked sexual harassment issues at NYC, NPR, The Takeaway, and Charlie Rose. Sadly, there are sexual harassment issues everywhere. I experienced
Every
them
workplace, in every
every
workplace
workplace.
in America, the media is not going to be exempt from that,
Yes,
unfortunately.
I experienced it at the New York Times. I had a very serious situation there. I think that that gives me a chance to do a little blurb about Susan, Linda, Nina, and Cokie, my new book that's coming out next week, because they came up at a time when women were not allowed to be on the air. They were relegated to research positions and behind the scenes positions, and they were subject, if you've seen The Good Girls Revolt, or read, even better, The Good Girls Revolt, about the Newsweek women who filed a lawsuit and won. Every single newsroom in the 70s had a lawsuit like that, where the women banded together and sued because of the harassment issues in the workplace. And it was actually less about the harassment and more about the parity. Um, so it's sadly a morphing and changing issue, and you will be startled to see the kinds of things that the women who were they call themselves the founding mothers of NPR, went through in their early parts of their career as they were struggling to get in the door. So it's bad, but it's better in that we can talk about it now, whereas back then it was not something that people felt they could without destroying their career. In fact, Nina Totenberg has some stories like that. So very interesting.
Yeah, no question about it. I don't see any more questions unless you do,
I
um, but they've all been really good.
Yeah,
And,
really excellent.
I've really enjoyed this. Um, so the book title is,
The new book is Susan, Linda, Nina, Cokie, The Extraordinary Story of the Founding Mothers of NPR. And the book about
does that all fit on the, does it all fit on the cover?
they did, yeah. Oh, I have it back here. Yes, yeah.
Okay, hold it up. You
Yeah.
can't hold it up? Please hold it up. Come on.
Commercial. And then
I mean, that's a long title. Oh, there
it
we
is
go.
it is a long title. Titles are the worst part of it. Well, no, the worst part of the book is the footnotes, but they're actually interesting.
Right.
This is Up All Night, about Ted Turner and CNN, the making of 24-hour news. It's coming out in paperback next month, and Chris at the library has a bunch of copies we're raffling off. How is she doing it? I'm reading.
We're gonna, if the audience puts their email address in, which they've been doing during the presentation, I'm gonna run a raffle through Google, and I'll send the winners the email tomorrow if they've won.
Fantastic. Yes. And I hope you'll have it in the library too, for anybody who wants to check it out, or them out, or my other books.
Yes,
And
we do. We have several copies.
perfect.
That's
Thank
fantastic.
Thank you. And thank you, NJ. It's so great to have this conversation with you in front of our friends here. And on behalf of the library and my dear friend Paige, who's been involved with the library for a long time. So I'm grateful to all of you for the chance to have this conversation and to promote the book. So thank you.
And it was great for me to catch up with you, Lisa, and we'll talk some more.
Well,
Because, I mean, look, we could obviously, we've gone way past the out time, and we could talk about this stuff all night because it fascinates me, and your opinions and your research really does fascinate me as well. So
thank you. And your experiences are it's so cool. So I want to see what's it called? Whatever. I want to see
the Degero app.
I want to,
I'll text it to you.
yeah, or I'll just come watch you do it.
You know.
Great.
Anyway, well, no, for me to be using that, something really, really bad has happened. So let's just hope that I'm not,
Okay.
it's
Okay.
kind of like, it's kind of like the president carrying like the football around, it's like, you hope you don't have to use it.
Gotcha.
So anyway, but thanks to everybody who logged on for this.
Yes.
And great questions. I really enjoyed it. And, I have great respect and appreciation for the viewers and for the people who take the time to find out what's going on and tune into local news. So thank you.
We need you. Keep going.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
It's such a crazy thing.